Lena and Aiden were inseparable. From the moment they met in their final year of high school, their connection felt destined, like they were two pieces of the same puzzle finally snapping into place. Lena was shy, with long black hair and soft brown eyes that seemed to always be lost in thought. Aiden was gentle, with an easy smile and a voice that could soothe even the most restless heart. They spent every weekend together, exploring their small town, taking long walks in the forest that bordered Lena's home, and making promises about their future. Lena had a special place in those woods, a small clearing next to a creek, hidden by towering pines. It was their sanctuary, a world untouched by the chaos of life. They would spend hours there, lying on the soft grass, staring up at the sky, talking about their dreams and fears. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, Lena looked at Aiden with a sad smile. "Promise me something?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything," Aiden replied without hesitation. "Promise me that, no matter what happens, you'll always find me. Even if I'm lost, even if it seems impossible." Aiden chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I promise. But why would you ever get lost?" Lena's eyes darkened for a moment, as if something heavy weighed on her. "You never know," she said, glancing toward the forest that had grown quiet as night settled in. "Sometimes people disappear." Aiden didn't think much of it at the time. Lena was always a little melancholy, haunted by thoughts that never fully made sense to him. But that was one of the things he loved about her mysteriousness, her depth. 2 years later, Lena was gone. It happened suddenly, without warning. One evening, Lena simply vanished. Aiden had texted her, called her, but there was no response. Her parents were frantic. The police were called, search parties were organized, and the entire town combed the surrounding area. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Lena. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. Aiden was devastated. He spent every waking moment looking for her, refusing to believe she was truly gone. He walked through the forest daily, retracing the steps they had taken so many times, hoping to find something, anything, that would lead him to her. The clearing by the creek became his second home, and every night, he would sit there for hours, waiting for her to return, just like she always had. But Lena didn't come back. It wasn't until 3 months after Lena's disappearance that something changed. Aiden was in the clearing, lying on the grass as he had done 100 times before, staring up at the stars. The night was unusually quiet, with not even the chirping of crickets to break the silence. He was about to leave when he heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "Aiden." He sat up, heart pounding. He knew that voice. It was Lena's. "Aiden, come find me." He stood up, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, more urgent. "Find me." Without thinking, Aiden plunged into the forest, following the voice. It was Lena, he was sure of it. She was calling to him, leading him deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around him, and the air grew colder, but he didn't care. All that mattered was finding her. The voice led him to a part of the forest he had never been to before. The trees here were older, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost swamp-like, and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring his path. But still, the voice called. "Find me." Aiden pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel her, she was close, so close. Then, in the distance, he saw a figure. It was faint, barely visible through the fog, but he recognized her immediately. "Lena," he cried, running toward her. But as he got closer, something wasn't right. The figure that stood before him wasn't the Lena he remembered. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those once warm, brown eyes, were empty, hollow. Her clothes hung off her in tatters, and her long black hair was matted with dirt. She stared at him, unblinking. "Aiden," she whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You promised." He stopped, fear gripping him. "Lena, what happened to you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the ground. Aiden looked down and felt his stomach drop. There, at his feet, half buried in the mud, was a small, weathered locket, the one he had given her on their 1-year anniversary. He knelt down, picking it up with trembling hands. The chain was broken, and the locket was cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been lying there for centuries. "I'm lost," Lena's voice came again, softer this time, almost mournful. "You have to find me." Aiden looked up, but Lena was gone. The fog had thickened, swallowing her whole. He was alone, standing in the middle of the forest with only the eerie silence to keep him company. After that night, things got worse. Aiden couldn't escape her. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, pale, hollow, broken. She would appear in his dreams, standing just out of reach, always whispering the same words, "Find me." It wasn't just the dreams, though. Strange things began happening around his apartment. Lights flickered on and off, objects moved on their own, and there were cold spots, unnaturally cold, like the air in the forest that night. Once, in the middle of the night, he woke to find the locket lying on his chest, even though he had locked it away in a drawer days before. Desperate, Aiden turned to Lena's parents for help. But they had already moved on, convinced that Lena was dead, buried somewhere deep in the forest, never to be found. They didn't believe in ghosts, in hauntings, in anything that couldn't be explained. But Aiden knew better. He knew Lena wasn't at rest. She was trapped, and she needed him. Determined to set her free, Aiden returned to the forest, armed with nothing but a flashlight and the locket. He followed the same path he had taken that night, back to the spot where he had seen her. The fog was there again, thick and oppressive, and the air was colder than ever. He called her name, over and over, but there was no response. Just the silence. Hours passed, and still, nothing. Exhausted and defeated, Aiden sat down, clutching the locket in his hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't keep my promise." And then, just as he was about to give up, he heard it. "Aiden." Her voice was faint, but unmistakable. He stood up, scanning the darkness, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "Lena," he breathed, taking a step toward her. She didn't move. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the ground again. Aiden followed her gaze, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Beneath the moss and mud, something glistened in the dim light of his flashlight. He knelt down, brushing the dirt away, and felt his heart stop. It was a skeleton. Lena's skeleton. The bones were old, brittle, but there was no mistaking the tattered remains of her dress, or the silver ring she had always worn on her right hand. Aiden collapsed to his knees, the weight of his grief crashing over him. She had been there all along, lying just beneath the surface, waiting for him to find her. And he had failed. Lena's ghost slowly faded into the mist, her whisper lingering in the air. "Thank you." Aiden never recovered. He had found Lena, just as he had promised, but it wasn't enough. The guilt consumed him, gnawing at him day and night. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped living. He became a shell of the person he once was, haunted by the memory of the girl he loved, and lost. The police recovered Lena's remains, but the cause of her death was never determined. Some said she had simply gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. Others whispered that something darker had taken her, something that lived deep in the woods, something that preyed on lost souls. But Aiden knew the truth. Lena hadn't been lost. She had been waiting. And now, as the nights grew longer and the air colder, Aiden could still hear her voice, echoing in the silence. "Find me."